before we get started, what I want to do is to encourage you to release yourself from looking at me, if that would be helpful. What we know is that there's something called Zoom fatigue. And Zoom fatigue happens when you're in a long Zoom meeting and you're trying to get the human to human cues that we're used to visually, and it doesn't work out as well. So I have found, and some people have found, that if you know you're going to relax, put your feet up, maybe turn off the camera, not look at your phone, you can often get the same kind of benefit out of a presentation on Zoom. Although I'm happy for people to be looking at me, because it's a great thing to know that so many people are interested in this topic. So I wanted to at least give us that permission.
So as David alluded to, this is the first in a series of learning sessions that we have planned. The next one will be on June 13th. It's going to be an introduction to strategies for trauma awareness and resilience. It's an online training that'll teach the basic concepts, models, and strategies of the 5-day STAR training. It's research and practice supported peace-building training that integrates neuropsychology, trauma healing and resilience, restorative justice, nonviolent conflict transformation, and broadly defined spirituality. And it's at the foundation of what Coming to the Table stands for. Donna Minter and Chriselle Schell, who are with the Minneapolis local group, have been teaching STAR concepts, models, and strategies for more than 10 years. They've trained more than 3,500 people in person and have trained recently 300 people online. So there'll be information coming out about that in a couple of weeks to sign up for the June 13th session. For today, Dr. David Campt has more than 25 years of professional experience. He's considered a national expert in the areas of inclusion and equity, cultural competence, and intergroup dialogue. His insights about the keys to more inclusive and effective institutions and communities have been sought by small executive boards of fewer than a dozen to large-scale summits involving thousands of people. His clients have varied widely and have included the US military, the White House, large corporations, international organizations, foundations, governments, universities, national association, nonprofits. David is also the author of a number of books, including The Little Book of Dialogue for Difficult Subjects and Read the Room for Real, How a Simple Technology Creates Better Meetings. In early 2016, he created a project called the Ally Conversation Toolkit, which has engaged thousands of people in person and online. Under this initiative, David has written 4 additional books: the White Ally Toolkit Workbook, Discussion Group Leaders Guide, and Compassionate Warrior Bootcamp for White Allies, and the Compassionate Warrior Bootcamp Spiritual Edition. And just in January, he released Compassion Transforms Contempt, a Black dialogue expert's advice for white progressives in down-revving anger, creating connections, and maybe changing the world. David's work on dismantling racism has been featured by a number of prominent media outlets such as Think Progress, and I hope you saw the bit on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. It's wonderful. David has a bachelor's degree in computer science from Princeton, a master's in public policy, and a doctoral degree in city planning from UC Berkeley. And on a personal note, I first met David at a big Kellogg Foundation conference in Southern California several years ago. I found his enthusiasm for this work inspiring and infectious. I'm excited that David is kicking off this first Coming to the Table learning session today. And we've got, like I said, a lot lined up in the months to come. And the next one I will mention is on the date that the national gathering would have taken place. So we hope that you'll join us then. And now it's a real honor to turn this over to Dr. David Campt. David.
In a progressive movement that has and will again be purposely targeted for manipulating people to define other people in the movement as sellouts and enemies, and these are people who have relatively minor disagreements. It is time for the people of compassion to step up and demonstrate that we can deeply respect people whom we deeply disagree with. In a world where there's a pandemic that's killing people and devastating livelihoods, but that is only one of many global problems that speak to the need for us to have more rather than fewer voices at the table. It's time for people of compassion to step up and say all voices count, so we can expand the table of decision making. Anybody who thinks of themselves as an anti-racism ally is by definition a person of compassion. That identity says, I want to be a force for increasing the amount of compassion in the world. This is a big task. What I want to talk about today are the powers, maybe the superpowers, that people in the anti-racism community have and often don't recognize, and share some ideas about how the people of compassion might get past impediments to doing so. I want to reinforce that I love the fact that there's so many people out there looking, and if you feel free to relax and just listen, that also is a fine way of experiencing this. But I just ask you, if you do that, do not be checking your phone to do something else. Okay. Okay. So just saying we have 95 people. All right. Yay for that. So let me give you a little background to how I came here today. If we could go to the slide after the cartoon in Gozai, that has a couple of people, one happy, one not so happy. So this picture is from the night of the 2016 election. I was more of the person on the right. And the reason I'm showing it is just because it grounds this work that I'm doing. Before the election happened, in the run-up to the election, I developed a project that was focused on having white folk who didn't like Donald Trump have conversations, mostly interviews where they're listening to people who did like Donald Trump. It was clear to me that there were tens of millions of people who, for whatever set of reasons, really had glommed onto this candidate who was clearly racially problematic, who clearly was going to lose, and they were going to be angry after that happened. And so I thought it would be very important for us to do the advanced healing work where people on the left essentially would find out, first, what do those people want? And second, what are the impediments to listening to people? So I got a little bit of money from some people with a lot of money and did about 60 listening sessions around the country. And one of the things that I learned about, which I'll be talking about, is how difficult it is for people to listen. So the election happened. Next slide. Obviously, it was very upsetting. I didn't look exactly like that person in that slide. Next slide. Or the people in this slide. As you might have seen Dave Chappelle say on Saturday Night Live, there was a certain degree to which Black people were not happy but not super upset, because we are familiar with the darkness in the heart of America, so we're not completely surprised. Next slide. Although some of us were upset, as you can see. But as I said, I was more of the person on the right. Perturbed, next slide. The perturbed and newly committed to seeing what I might do. I processed the election. We need to go back to the one that says epic fail. Yeah. I processed the election as an epic white ally fail. My sense was that many things caused this result. Hillary not going to Wisconsin, James Comey making very weird decisions, Russian interference, voter suppression. But one of the things that happened was that a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of white folks, did not know how to have decent conversations with people in their circle about the question of whether or not Mr. Trump was too racially problematic to elect. They didn't know how to have those conversations. They had them, they didn't have them, they had them really poorly. So thus, in a situation in which everything has to line up for Mr. Trump, that mattered too. And so I became committed to thinking about how do we upgrade the capacity of white progressive people to talk to people in their circle about difficult issues, about race, which was obviously key to that campaign, or about anything else related to that. Next slide. It became clear that white folks have a very, very significant schism in their community about talking about important issues, talking about race, talking about the conservative liberal divide. That became clear from the project I did before the election, and it's become increasingly clear over the period of years where I've been focusing on trying to coach white allies about how to have useful conversations with their comrades, with their family members, etc. I've worked, one could call my capacity to articulate and frame dialogue efforts as my superpower. As you heard, I've written books before the ones that I've written for this project that are used around the world. And if I have a superpower, it's in trying to invite people into dialogic space. You guys do that, you're coming to the table. That's important to do. One of the things that the election taught me is that we need to do that at a different kind of scale. It is vital, it is important that we create settings of dialogue for people to have conversations across lines of division. But we have to face the fact that only so many people are going to be involved in those. So I said, maybe what I need to do is to try to push what I know about dialogue and how to create it out to disseminate through the white progressive population. So I have to think about how do you boil that expertise down? How do you frame that up so that people can take it up who are not in the sessions with me? So that became something I'm very concerned about. And that's what I'm still committed to, especially now the election is back again. It is clear to me that the divisions that are in our society and are in families are counterproductive to our moving forward as a democracy. Next slide. So, as you can see from the slide, even the esteemed Mick Jagger knows polarization affects families and groups of friends. It's a paralyzing situation. It's a civil war of opinion. So we need to figure out, as a progressive community, as an American community, as an anti-racist community, what do we need to do collectively so that more white folks who think racism is a problem can have better conversation, more effective conversation with white folks in their neighborhood, in their church, in their family, people that they know. How do we do that? So now in doing this project, it has become very clear that white folks got some work to do. Y'all especially have some work to do around the issue of empathy. Next slide. A friend of mine, after a workshop, he said he thinks white folks suffer from EDD, empathy deficit disorder. He said that the way that white folks will throw away their family members, will decide, I'm not talking to you anymore, is actually a cultural weakness. a weakness that's potentially born of years and years, centuries perhaps, of a certain notion of independence as opposed to interdependence. I would invite you to reflect upon whether this phenomenon of people discarding each other because of political beliefs, or for that matter, other behaviors, especially political beliefs, is something that is something that's relevant to your family, your tribe, your clan with a C, and is other cultural differences. I will submit that we should think about that, and that we all would do better if we didn't do that as much. But one way not to do that as much is to develop the skills to engage across lines of difference. It is vital that we do that if we're going to deal with the problem of racism, because frankly, there are some very, very problematic trends within white folks' view of issues. Next slide. One of the things we know from polling data is that the portion of white people who think that racism against white people is just as significant of a national problem as racism against people of color is 55%. You can just put the animation down. Another disturbing fact is that the portion of white people who think that blacks are less evolved than whites is 38%. You saw that next one. And the portion of white folks who think that black folks are less industrious than white people, essentially the whole black people are lazy thing, in 2016 was 32%. So one of the things that, by the way, as horrible as this is, in 1990, a mere 30 years ago, it was 60%. So thank you, white folks, for upgrading your views. But the point is that we should not be surprised that, given the legacy of racism, there remains a lot of problematic ways of thinking within the white population. And I think it is vital that we equip white folks who I would call allies as opposed to post-racialists. People think racism is over, or racism skeptics, people are skeptical that racism against people of color is a particular problem. It is vital that we give white allies the conversational tools necessary. And we, as I will further develop, developing those skills and using those is a superpower, is a particular superpower that white allies have that we need to cultivate. Okay. Next is go to the next slide, and also bring up the polling questions. Ngozi, you can't see her, but she is my technical expert. So the question is, if you're really honest, would you say that you have a bias against people on the opposite side of the ideological divide, liberal conservative divide, than yourself? Because I think I'm gonna need your help in figuring out when to close the polling. Can you see the people voting?
Nobody's voted yet, so go ahead and vote, everyone.
So one of the things that happens, like I love Zoom, and as y'all know, if y'all seen me in person, I love polling. But one of the things about Zoom polling is that it's really cool, but it is like, it works about 85% of the time. So its non-working rate is higher than your typical polling in a room. So are people not voting?
No.
Okay.
I've just asked them online in the chat if they can see it. Okay, people say they're voting.
Okay.
Give it another second.
You might read the results so I can see them.
Let's see what we got here. No results showed up.
Okay, so again, like I told y'all, Zoom Polling is great unless it ain't. It has like a 1 out of 6 rate rate, so it's hard to know. Sometimes you get through a whole show and it works completely, and other times maybe not. So we got any results and goes out, should we move on? Okay, all right. So we're gonna move forward on that. So here is what is important to recognize. It seems that a whole bunch of us on the left, especially white folks, we have a bias against people on the right, and okay, we're against them, I got that. And we're disinclined to talk to them. Let me show you a polling result that shows that. Next slide and goes on. Polls done by Pew. Basically the question was, when you think about talking to somebody who feels differently about Trump than you do you imagine that being stressful and frustrating, or interesting and informative? So you can see that slide, it goes, so here's what the overall answer to that question was. Given the polarization of society, 59% of folks thought of that as stressful and frustrating as opposed to interesting and informative. Overall, 59%. But let's drill down. Conservative folk answered that it's stressful and frustrating talking to somebody who didn't like Trump at a level of 52%. Black folks, Black Democrats, found it frustrating at a level of 56%. Latino folks found it frustrating at a level of 61%. White folks found it frustrating at a level of 74%. So arguably, the people who most need to be talking to Trump supporters, if you're going to move the needle on racism or move the needle on the election, the people who are most in contact with the folks who we want to influence, i.e. white progressives, are the most disinclined to have conversation, or the most likely to have them in a stressed out, frustrated mode, which would likely mean they're not having them successfully. We need to do something about that. We need to train people to coach people so that they can find those conversations informative and interesting, as opposed to stressful and frustrating, and thus avoid them. Next slide. I want to tell you a little story about what dialogue can do and how to think about it. Because it is this dialogue, this interpersonal dialogue, that I think we so need to focus on. This is a picture of Camden, New Jersey, known for being a city with a lot of blight in it. You can go back to me and goes on. So several years ago, about 2003, I was working for a group called Hope in the City. It's out of Richmond. And we were trying to export our dialogue model to other cities around the country. And so Camden was one of them. So I went to Camden with another co-facilitator, and we were doing, somebody done some advanced work to find people who wanted to facilitate interracial dialogue. So we had a group of people, maybe it was about 10, I think it was about 10 people, both black, white, and Latino. And a couple of the black people were this older black couple who were dressed to the nines, dressed to the T, very, very professional, clearly working class, and clearly from the activist tradition. They had an activist background. So they were stalwart fighters against racism. So in the course of our 2 days of training, over 3 days of training, but 2 full 16 hours of training, we tried to explain what dialogue is and explain our racial reconciliation model, and we were trying to put them in a position where they could learn how to be facilitators. So as we try to explain that dialogue process, the gentleman, let's call him Carl, he asked a couple times, so when do we get to deliver our information that we have about the nature of structural racism so people really understand it. So he asked that a couple times, and my colleague and I would explain that, well, facilitation isn't really about that. It's about something different. You're trying to have people have a conversation that reveals to them dynamics in society they might not understand. This isn't really about delivering sermons. Yeah, so he said. So he was generally very quiet, but he asked that question a couple of times. So when it came time for him to facilitate, because everybody had a chance to facilitate with the person, he would, in his facilitation role, he would deliver many sermons, and then they would actually, he would guys as a question, don't you agree that? And then he would have some long sermonette about the nature of structural racism. So everybody got a chance to go. People got feedback about the process, and other people went. By the end of the time, on our last closing session, he got a little look on his face and he goes, I think I get it now. We're doing surgery on people's souls. It isn't about talking to them. We're doing surgery on their souls. And me and my facilitator look at each other like, I think he gets it now. So part of what we're trying to do is to put you in a position to do that kind of surgery, to do surgery on people's souls. That takes training. That takes techniques you have to learn. And so part of what I think we need to think about is, what do we need to do as a community to give folks who can make a difference in the society, people who, if we mobilize them enough, can potentially turn elections? What do we need to do to create a healing force of people who can do that surgery? That I think is the central question we have to ask ourselves. Next slide. So, surgery on the soul is a serious matter. We're reformulating how people think about themselves, how they think about society, how they think about their relationships. It requires some skill. But we should not think of it as it requires so much skill that only a small set of people who are qualified as facilitators do it. We need to figure out how to translate what that is down so that everybody in this audience and everybody who's coming to the table and everybody beyond that, everybody who thinks racism is real, can engage people in their circle and begin to do some of that surgery. Appropriately paced, with all deliberate speed, but focus on getting that done. So we can move that number from 55% of white folks who don't think racism is real to some other number. The goal of this project, to be clear, is that by 2025, that number is at 45%, not 55%. The folks who don't think racism is real. So that's the goal of the project. To do that, we need to spread these skills far and wide. So what we're going to do is to recruit people into the effort to do that. That's my objective. Next slide. What's surgery? Surgery is a medical specialty, uses operative manual and instrument techniques on a person to investigate or treat a pathological condition, such as disease or injury, to help improve bodily function or appearance or repair unwanted or ruptured areas. I think that there's unwanted and ruptured areas within America's soul. And what I'm trying to do is to recruit people who want to work on that. And here's the good news. Good news is you don't have to go to marches. You don't have to take a lot of real risks in order to do this. You just need to start talking more effectively to the people that you know. So the question is, how do you do that? Next slide. I'm a surgeon. What is a superpower? My wife's a surgeon. What she does is amazing. She's an orthopedic surgeon. That's fantastic. I don't know how people do what they do. But I find what they do amazing. And I want to offer that what I'm suggesting that we start engaging ourselves in is something amazing too, which is doing surgery on the soul and supporting each other in doing that. Next slide. To train as a surgeon, we got to think about a few things. We got to think about what are the ailments that we have to deal with. Got to get some clarity on that. What are the impediments to addressing the ailments? And what are the powers that surgeons need to cultivate into superpowers? So that's what I'm talking about for the rest of our time together. Okay, next slide. Ailment number 1 is othering. This ain't nothing new to y'all. I'll let you look at the cartoon. What does this say? What this says is that some of the people who complain about othering in society, complain about othering other people, or do the same thing themselves. That's an ailment that's it's in society and will keep you from being the best surgeon that's possible. Part of what we try to get people to do as they try to help combat othering is to not do it themselves. We do too much of that. Next slide. We also want to combat denial. Y'all are coming to the table. Y'all deal with the legacy of enslavement. Y'all know that there is a significant amount of denial about America's racial legacy that we're trying to cope with, that you are founded to address. So we have to think with some discernment about how do we deal with that? How do we invite people out of denial? I'm not sure that the way to do that is to point at people and holler at them that you're in denial. I'm not sure that works. So, but that's an ailment that we have to think about. Next slide. We got to think about the hierarchy of value. This is straightforward. Part of what we have to address is all of us have been trained to value some people more than others. Specifically in the US context, we've been trained to value white people more than people of color. White people of color are subject to that same thinking as well. So the question is, how do we undermine that? That's the ailment. How do we deal with that? Next slide. Another ailment is the racist, non-racist binary. As I said, everybody in society has been trained to think of certain people as more valuable than others. Some must fight against it more than others. Our social position augments that or not. But part of what we need to get out of, part of what has developed, is the idea that some people are racist and some people are not racist. And I think that that is one of the most damaging regimes of thought to the process of helping us deal with racism. We define some people as racist and others as not, and I don't think that's helpful. I often don't use the word racist. I often call people racially problematic because I think that the way we use racist as opposed to non-racist is a problem. It's part of what impedes us from making progress is that binary. So thank God society's evolved enough where a whole bunch of people who are not anti-racist, but they don't think of themselves as racist either. And in fact, they're good because they're not racist. The racist people, those black people over there. So the question becomes, how do we combat that? And I want to suggest to you that part of what happens is in the anti-racism community is we buy into that. We buy into that by thinking that some people are, those other people are racist, I gotta go change them. I'm not that. And I think that is unhelpful to our goal. Next slide. Another thing that we have to do as we try to create a community of people that are apprentice surgeons of the soul, we need to grapple with dysfunctions in the ally culture. And one of those dysfunctions, let's go up on the screen, there it is the woker than thou idea. Part of what happens in the interests of the community and on the left generally is that people are in some sort of weird competition to be the most woke person around. And so what that does is it makes people give each other zero grace and a lot of grief. That is not helpful to the process of us collectively learning, to the process of us recognizing that we all are affected by the same disease. The woker than thou mentality, it is a reflection of the racist, non-racist binary that's so unhelpful. It produces some dysfunctions on the left among the anti-racist community that keeps us from both being in community, being humble, and we bring a different and not helpful energy when we're talking to people who are not in that community. So I just went through several ailments that we need to work on if we're going to collectively advance the movement to drive that number down. 55% of white folks don't believe it. And if we're going to do so by each of us supporting each other and becoming the best surgeons of the soul possible. Next slide. Okay, so what are the ailments? What are the resources? The good news is that we're at a time in history where we know enough about cognition to understand what works well versus not well in terms of persuasion. I want to run down these pretty quickly. So one of them, next slide, is something called the Backfire Effect. The Backfire Effect basically represents the fact that if you try to talk somebody away from a belief that they have, and you try to use facts to do it, in an overwhelming majority of cases, those facts don't work and they just dig down and double down on their beliefs. So the sermons that my man Carl was gonna try to give people don't work. And they don't work in a group setting, and they don't work especially in interpersonal settings. Sometimes in a group setting, a lecture can impact people, but as a general matter, if you're trying to influence somebody else, on facts that try to explain the situation to them does not work. It doesn't work on racism, doesn't work for other things. That's the Backfire Effect. Next slide. Empathy. Empathy breeds empathy. There's been some research that shows, a fair amount of research that shows that the best way to get somebody to listen to you, listen to your point of view, is listen to their point of view first. Essentially, if you want to get them to take you seriously, take what you believe seriously, you need to listen to them first. Now think about how that dynamic plays off in conversations that you have seen yourself or other people have when people don't believe racism is real. Do we listen to them first? Do we start by asking more questions? Or do we start by the lectures, the little sermonettes? Empathy breeds empathy. Next slide. There's something called mirror neurons that we know about now. Mirror neurons are a phenomenon in human cognition where we try to emulate what we think is the state of mind of somebody else if we're connected to them. So if I tripped up here on my shoelace, even if I couldn't hear it, some of y'all would say, oops, even though y'all didn't move. Because if you identify with me, you're likely to do that. We've all seen mirror neurons operating around laughter, around yawning. My mirror neurons on tears are really highly more calibrated than I would like. So somebody starts crying, I start crying, even don't know what they're crying about. So, but this phenomenon varies from person to person, but is a general phenomenon in human experience. And so what we want to try to do when we try to influence somebody is to really identify with them and get that going, so that when we move to the point of trying to get them to see that racism is real, how we feel about it, they're identified with us. The last one is the power of the strategic concession. One of the things that negotiators will tell you is that the best way to try to get somebody to move from their position is to try to make some concession to their position first. that increases significantly your chance of moving people forward. Now, how does that play off in the racial context? Next slide. One of the things that I encourage people to do as they're trying to move post-racialists forward, people who think that we got no more racial problems, one thing I try to encourage people to do is to figure out what is a domain of racial progress that you feel comfortable talking about, that you would say, you know, we have made progress on X, Y, or Z. It is a superpower is the ability to do that and to occupy that, make you feel that you feel it. Now, this isn't just me talking. I used to do congressional pilgrimages with John Lewis when he would take every year. God bless him. He goes down to the civil rights sites, taking his fellow congresspeople. I used to be on those trips as a facilitator. One thing I heard him say was, the only thing more irritating, or only thing as irritating, as white people who say there's no more racial progress to be made, we made it, it's black people who say we've not made any progress. We've made significant progress. And I'm telling you that as an official black person. Now, what's important to be able to do is to occupy that feeling. You by saying we made significant progress in some areas, that doesn't mean you're not conceding completely, but you're saying we have made significant progress. So what I encourage people to do is to come up with a couple of racial progress stories that they can tell. Now, the anti-racism, hard left progressive culture will tell you not to do that. They tell you never concede. Don't concede because you give mental, take a mile. There's risks of that being true, but the truth is that a strategic concession and conversation can often help you get further because people will more likely make a concession to you if you make a concession to them. And the strategic concessions around racial progress are important to learn how to articulate, learn how to occupy, and learn how to use in conversation. The last point is the power of story. One of the things that we know, lawyers will tell you this, certainly people in Hollywood will tell you this, is that people learn more from stories than they do from facts. So part of what we try to teach people how to do is to shift their approaches to persuasion away from facts and to stories. So you got to learn how to cultivate stories from your own experience that you occupy so that you are firing up their mirror neurons as you're telling them, so that they can come to potentially see the world closer to how you see it. Okay, what does all that add up to? Next slide. There's basically a couple of principles that we need to remember if we're going to do soul surgery. One, we want to shift the conversation from beliefs and facts to storytelling on personal experiences. And second, ABC, alignment before challenges. If you're trying to move someone in a position, it's vital that you create a sense of alignment with them, a sense of agreement with them before you try to challenge them to a new way of thinking. We often don't want to do that. We're so busy delivering people lectures, which might come from a place of we're othering them because we're not happy the way they've othered other people. We don't want to align with them. We have to learn to cultivate the inclination, the desire to align with them, as well as the techniques of how to do that, so we maximize our influence. So all of those two principles are embodied in the core methodology that I try to teach. I'll just run through it briefly. It's something called the RACE method. Again, remember, what I'm trying to do is to figure out a way to articulate these things in a way that potentially goes something like viral, that could have its own momentum without me. So call it the RACE method for racial conversations. You can see why that might be helpful to give people a mnemonic to remember. The RACE method stands for reflect, ask, connect, expand. I'll say what each of those stages are briefly. Reflect means you got to calm down if you're going to have a conversation about race. as we just saw, a whole bunch of white folks get really agitated in thinking about a conversation about Trump. I could ask a same question about race. You got to calm down in order to make strategic choices in the conversation. Ask. You want to ask questions. Remember, people are more likely to empathize with you if you empathize with them first. So get them talking about their experiences related to their beliefs. Go beneath the belief to, we're talking about experience related to that. How did you learn that? You have to be in a position to listen to that and make that a positive experience. So reflect, calm down, ask questions to get them talking with their experience. Connect. You're using storytelling to create alignment, to create the sense that, you know, we're not so different. We have some level of agreement. Figuring out how to do that, when somebody says something racially problematic, that's a little bit of a skill. You have to think about how do you do that. It's possible to do that, but you have to think through that to find a way to create the rapport. You know, I don't completely judge you. I understand where you're coming from. I can agree with some piece of that, not necessarily the racist part, but some piece of that. I can appreciate you for being honest. I can agree with a little bit of what you said, and we're vibing now, so that by the time you get to the last stage, the expand stage, they're ready to listen to you. They're ready to take you seriously because they have already taken your experiences as something to take seriously. Next slide. So again, reflect, ask, connect, expand. To do this, it takes practice. You have to try. You'll do it better the 5th time than the first time, and the 20th time than the 5th time. But it's a discipline. You're learning how to do that surgery. Okay. So we've talked about the ailments. We've talked about the resources, the methods. Now let's talk about the powers that can become superpowers. Next slide. One of the powers is vulnerability. Soul surgery is different than surgery done on the hospital table. To most effectively do soul surgery, it's important for you to get vulnerable. You're asking the other person to get vulnerable. It is important for you to do that, for you to expose some parts of yourself which you might not feel great about, but expose that to give that visibility, because your vulnerability is often what is engaging and impactful for people. Next slide. Of course, there's always the issue of courage. I'm not sure I need to explain that. We're not necessarily in a society that encourages us to expose our vulnerability. It takes courage to do that. We somehow think something bad is going to happen. I have found that as a general matter, the notions of harm that will come to us when we expose ourselves, usually they're more notions than reality. So part of what we want to do is to cultivate our own capacity for courage. So in the moment, we can step into that situation and not think it's not going to work out. Next is the power of modeling. If you're going to ask somebody to look at the racism in their own heart, it is really valuable for them to see you doing that. So one of the most important things I try to coach people how to do is to develop the capacity to tell their own stories when they have racially problematic thoughts. We're way too reluctant to expose that. We have all been infected by the disease. And so what's important for us to learn how to do is to lift that up so people can see that good people like us can. We're much better able to convince somebody to look at the racism in their own soul if we're not going, you have a problem and I don't. We're much more likely to do that if we can say, let me show you the racism in my soul. You got any of that? Yeah, don't you have a little bit of that? Doesn't it ever come up? Let me tell you when mine came up. And tell that. That's not the only kind of story to invite people to see racism, but that is the most powerful kind because they cannot deny your own experience. So if you're talking about your own experience of racism, they can't deny that. They can deny some secondhand story you might have heard from Jamal. They can deny some story where you saw racial privilege, which is essentially an interpretive issue, but they cannot easily deny, you know, I got on the elevator with the black guy and I got really nervous. Or the black guy came to our meeting at work and I was like, ooh, he's remarkable, he's pretty smart. And I never think that about white people. Or whatever it is for you. So the point here is that we need to cultivate the capacity to tell our own stories of racial bias. So I'm gonna try to model that and tell you all a brief story. So several months ago, I was in Minneapolis, and in Minneapolis, if you've been there, downtown, like they have a series of air pedestrian bridges connecting the buildings because it's so cold in the winter, people want to be able to get from one place to another without battling the cold. So at the time, I was doing something I need to get back to now, which is trying to do 10,000 steps a day. And so I was just walking around almost randomly to just like get my steps in for the day. So walking down the hall, walking down one of these places, and I see there's not many black people, not that many black people. So I started to, I saw some guy and saw a black guy, and I kind of tried to nod at him. He didn't really nod back. He was a younger guy. And I was looking for that look, and he didn't really give it to me. Not really. I noticed he has a backpack, doesn't have, I think that the guy looked a lot of Somalians there. He looked like he's Somalian. So I just like let that go. That's why I didn't look back that much. Okay, fine. So I go and I make a turn and I'm walking around. And at some point I turn around and I notice the guy is walking now in my direction behind me. Well, that's interesting. He was just going the other way a little while ago. So I keep going. I'm from Detroit, so I have a developed sense of danger sometimes. So I make another turn and I'm walking and that's and I'm there again. So I'm like, okay, what is this dude doing? Why is this guy behind me? What's going on here? So I got a little extra nervous. Let me calm down. There's nothing here. I make another turn and the dude is still behind me. So I'm like, okay, wait a minute. That is not this. Something's wrong here. This dude, I don't know what's up with him. So I need to take evasive action. So what I did was I stopped, took out my phone and started checking my phone to let the dude go by. So he doesn't notice me again. He doesn't appear to notice me. He goes by. I take a deeper breath. And then he goes to some luggage shop where like a little hole-in-the-wall luggage shop, much smaller than the stores around him, run by looking like a Somalian dude. And they clearly had a previous conversation about him fixing his bag. So nothing is there. So now, then I'm thinking about, like, why am I tripping out? Because some young dude who I'm bigger than in broad daylight in this, essentially, it's like a mall area. Why am I tripping out about that? So what I gotta look at is I am manifesting the same kind of white racial superiority and the same kind of assumptions about black criminality that anybody is subject to. So I gotta look at that kind of issue. And so what I just did now was to own up to that fact that I can be a victim, can manifest that too. So what I want to do is to summarize. If we could go 2 slides forward to the key takeaways, I want to give us time for questions. So the polling obviously is not going to work today. Here's what we need to remember. We need to think of ourselves as doing surgery on people's souls. That is, I think, a useful construct for the kind of interpersonal work that we're doing. We have to remember there's some problems in US culture, and there are problems in the anti-racism community for that matter. And one of the ways that we can be an agent of fixing them is to begin to train ourselves as those surgeons. The ability to talk to people who look at things very differently than we do, whether it's race or Mr. Trump or whatever, is a vital, vital capacity for the president and in our democracy. We gotta learn to calm ourselves down to do that, and we gotta learn to tell our own stories. And we have to get trained how to do that. So in a minute, I'm going to talk about training opportunities for you to be aware of. But first, I just want to close by lifting up that there are people who have used their superpowers as allies that should inspire you to do so. If you could go to the next slide. There's a legacy that you're building on. So the first person I want to talk about is a guy named Vernon Dahmer. Okay, so somehow the slides are up, I'll just talk about him. So Vernon Dahmer was somebody, there's a white man in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, who basically was a voting rights activist. He was a member of the NAACP, and he was very active in trying to get people to vote. His favorite phrase was, "If you don't vote, you don't count." In 1966, his house was attacked by the Klan. They basically burned the house down while he was in it. He was successful in saving his wife and children, but he had smoke inhalation and died a few days later. He stepped forward to use his superpower at the time as just him being a white person committed to these issues. You stand on the back of on the shoulders of James Reed. You might have heard of James Reed, lieutenant minister who went down to Selma, Alabama, to help with the voting rights struggle, killed on the street by white men with clubs just for being an aid to people of color. His presence, at that point, his presence was a superpower he was struck down for that. You probably know the name of Viola Liuzzo, who similar fate, a martyr for the cause of racism. There have been white people who have put themselves on the line for the sake of moving the ball on racism. Their superpower at the time was just their presence. If they can do that, then the people on this call can develop different superpowers which are less risky to deal with Dylan and Hannah, who are your cousins and neighbors, when they say racially problematic things, or even when they don't, if you need to adjust their attitude. So I want to invite y'all to join a course that we're doing for Come to the Table, the Come to the Table family. It's a course that starts on June the 9th. It's a 5-session online course. It involves blended learning, both asynchronous. You'll be doing work outside of the sessions as well as the sessions. And the goal is to give you that training to do that surgery on souls that we've been talking about. So you can be an effective agent to try to move the ball on racism. The price of the course is $99. A couple months ago it was much more than that, but things have shifted. So I know that people have less resources, so it's important for us to maximize the number of people. So it's $99, but there's ways that you can get even more off. So basically any particular chapter that has 8 or more people should contact us, and we'll give everybody 10% off. So let us know about that. So that's one incentive, but we also have a race to the top incentive, so that the chapter that has the most people gets a copy of, everybody in the chapter, everybody who goes gets a copy of my book. Hold on just a minute. My book, The White Ally Toolkit, everybody gets, people from the winning group, the chapter with the most participants gets a copy of this, and then also we give a copy of the discussion guide to the leader so that you can carry on your work after the course is over. So that's what, that's an important incentive. We really are excited about this collaboration coming to the table. Y'all are a great organization, and I am hoping that a lot of people want to sign up. People that we've done these courses before, now we come to the table, and people get a lot out of them. People find that the methods they learn to move the ball on racism are also helpful in other areas of their life. They're helpful. We're teaching general communication, universal communication principles about persuasion and applying them to the issue of racism, but they have other applicability too. So thank you so much, and I'll be happy to take some questions from anybody who has them.
So if you indicate in the chat you have a question, then I'll go ahead and unmute you and you can ask it yourself.
Hi, this is AJ calling from Missoula, Montana. Thank you so much. It was really powerful and informative. I was wondering if there's been any research that shows we can be more effective if we're talking to someone in our own of our own gender. So are women better able to impact other women, or men better able to impact other men? And I'll say my question comes from, I have more trouble talking to white men about anti-racism things than I do talking to white women. So I'm curious about that. Thank you.
Got you. So I would say that that's a really good question. And I have not analyzed that question. I'm not familiar with that research. My intuition would be that your intuition that it's easier in the same gender is probably true. This is the nature of sexism and the nature of identification that happens. But so I think that's, my intuition would be there's probably some marginal positive impact of being in the same group. But I think the most important thing is that if you're going to do this kind of work, what you want to do is to figure out a way to be less triggered by it. So it might mean that what you need to do if you were to go up a ladder of development is that you start out working with women because you're less triggered. And over time, part of what you need to work on is how to be less triggered by what they say. And it could be that after you work with some women and have these kind of conversations, perhaps, and you might even start out there with people who are less problematic than others, so that by the time it's like it's developing a muscle. It's like developing a tolerance for certain types of interactions, so that by the time that you are further down the road of development, may be ready to deal with men because they are more triggering for you. The critical thing is to try to get a hold of that being triggered. So it's really good that you notice that, and I think your practice should be guided by that reality while you're working on that capacity.
Okay, next we have Mahina.
Hi, thank you very much for doing this today. My question is the process different for Black people than for white, given that the risk of harm exists for the Black person in a way it doesn't for a white person?
Yeah, so there have been many people who've gone through our trainings who are people of color and who've benefited from it. Because we teach universal principles. But there is no question, and I say this at the start of trainings, that these methods are harder to use on the topic of racism for people of color. Because remember the connect step. The connect step is about creating a set of alignment and agreement with something before you try to expand their thinking. And so if you're a Black person or a person of color, and you're engaged in this conversation because they either have said or they have racially problematic views, it's just harder for you to decide to connect to them, to decide and execute things to build rapport. It's not impossible, it's just harder. So what people have to do is decide they want to take this on. And as an overall society, I think we shouldn't leave it to people of color doing this work anyway, right? It's white people's work. That doesn't mean people of color can't do it. It just means that we need to recognize that it's harder, and to give people to maybe some people will decide, you know, I can't really do this. I'm gonna leave this to my white allies to do, and that's perfectly reasonable. So your intuition is correct. It is harder to do. It's not impossible.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm here from Baltimore. The piece about using experiences and stories rather than facts is really helpful. One of the things that I've gotten into discussions recently with folks who talk about that evolution component that you were talking about, how Black folks are less evolved, and that IQ tests show that there's, you know, a hierarchy in intelligence, even though the IQ tests were created by eugenicists. And we live in a world now where, you know, it's like my facts come from here and their facts come from a YouTube video they saw, you know. So is that what you would say in terms of, like, you know, in a society where even facts don't matter? It seems to me that that part about telling stories and experiences is more important than ever.
Well, certainly the assault on facts is a problem in general.
Yeah.
But, so that's the case. But the finding that people are not shifted by facts, I think it goes back a couple decades. So just to put a finer point on it, I think 23% of people are something called scientifically curious, which means that they're subject to changing their point of view based on facts. But the other 77% of us are not, basically. And that's, by the way, there's no difference between conservatives and liberals on that. So basically, facts do not work that much. Now, the fact that, I think that the fact that we have a trend against facts is really bad for society. But for the sake of changing people's deeply held views, I mean, it makes things worse, but it was already a problem, right? So certainly the assault on facts pushes us in a direction. It underlines the need for us to talk about experiences, but facts weren't working even before the recent assault on facts.
Okay.
So I think it all puts in the same direction. What you want, if you're trying to influence somebody, what you want to do is to not rely on facts. Certainly, what you said is relevant to that, because we have differences of facts anyway. But even before that trend was as true, you wouldn't want to rely on facts anyway, because that's not how people move. That's not how you shift other people's positions in general.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I just want to mention that Alan doesn't have a microphone, but you answered his question previously. So we are going to go ahead to, let's see, Nicole.
All right, hi.
Hey there.
And thank you, Dr. Campt, and your unnamed technical support person for running this.
Her name is Ngozai.
So I have a weird question. Well, I don't know if it's a weird question. So I am recently involved in a group that is focusing on addressing anti-Black racism. And as that allies group, you know, we want it to be more inclusive. And I feel like I have a pretty good take so far, always more to learn, on addressing white people and white behavior and white fragility, but I do not feel at all qualified to address that coming from, or whatever fragilities or issues that other non-Black allies of color are experiencing or bring to our table. Recently had recently had a woman who is Native American who came on with some really, you know, legitimate, but still I don't know how you can be both legitimate and inappropriate, somehow that works, criticisms about something that she saw on a Black activism site page. And I was at a little bit of a loss as to how to handle that. All I could do was speak from my perspective obviously, and tell her that, you know, I hope that she would consider joining us, because we need more information, we need more viewpoints, we need more voices. And I was just wondering if that's something that has come up for you. And again, like obviously the main issues fundamentally come from white people, white perspective, white supremacy, but how do we engage other activists of color who are not Black?
Okay, so I think here's what strikes me right at this moment. If you have a organization, an entity, an effort that is specifically designed to deal with anti-Black racism, that's what I thought you said,
Mm-hmm.
then that group has to decide what does it do with racism against other groups.
Right.
It probably is not helpful. I mean, I think that your inclination to want to include other people is a great inclination, and obviously, Black people are not the only people who are otherized.
Right. Or prejudice coming from those groups also. So it's like, I don't feel right correcting another person of color on their perspective of a Black issue the way that I feel okay sharing that information with another white person. And definitely it's, you know, I'm still working on where the ego falls into it and whether I'm teaching or listening or what have you. But I'm not, it's been and we are a very, very small group. We're a tiny little group that is just starting. We want to evolve into, you know, a more intersectional effort, but our focus is definitely anti-Blackness.
Okay, so what I'm saying is that y'all need to decide as a group how quickly you want to start engaging other issues. That's one. So that can't just be your decision. It needs to be the group decision, number one. Number two, I think that as a general proposition, we need to always revisit the question of how much are we thinking of ourselves as correcting people anyway, which is kind of what you said. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's often more hazards in the mentality that I'm trying to correct other people, as opposed to I'm offering my experience up of how something sounds or how it feels to me, right? And giving people so there's a difference between you shouldn't say that and when you say that, I feel this way, right? So one, you'll have an institutional choice to make a group choice about like how quickly you want to expand our group. But then in terms of you interacting with people, I would suggest to try to lower the dial on correcting. But you know, if somebody says something, if somebody's asking you, if a Native American person is asking for your feedback about something that a Black person said on a Facebook page or whatever, I mean, I think it's legitimate for you to say, well, I probably wouldn't say that. And when I heard that, that felt icky to me. But you might want to talk to that person about that. I'm just saying that's different than saying it how something felt to you is different than telling the Native American person that that was wrong. Like that felt bad to you. But if the real issue that they might need to have is with them, and that same thing goes with talking to them. They say something they say something you don't like about Black people. You can tell them how that feels to you. That takes more courage because you're closer to correcting them. But I would just encourage you to try to. We want to get out of as a general matter, get out of the correcting business and get more to the connecting business. But we still sometimes will offer forward challenging ideas, but connect first. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, I think the challenge really is like when we have other people of color saying anti-Black racist things or trying to tone police or whatever. Like we don't want to be tone policing anybody in their expression. Like I'm just not sure how to engage those folks in it, because like there is and maybe this is my limitation of being able to connect probably with other people of color. You know, I fully admit that. I find it easier to say, you know, it's a lot easier to say to another white people, you know, people like you and me, or, you know, it's like immediately pull them into that perspective. And obviously that's not something I can do necessarily,
right, exactly.
Or would try to, you know.
But it's the reverse. Like you have the superpower I've been talking about, which is y'all's capacity to connect to other white people, make them feel comfortable, to make them feel like they're watching, that they're witnessing somebody who's grappling with issues, who has the same background on some basic level. That's your superpower. that is diminished when you're talking to somebody else, right? By the very nature of that.
Okay, we have reached the end of our time. We have a few more questions, and I'm going to get to those, but I just want to say, Nicole, I see your nails, and I'm living for them. And just to let you know that I've included a link to the flyer in the chat, and you can also go to our website, dialoguecompany.com at any time, and you can see a variety of things we have, particularly our new publication, Compassion Transforms Contempt, which is about the left-right political divide. Now, let's see, we are going to move on. Okay, Diane, you're up.
Hey, Diane.
Hi, how are you? So it's a quick question. When someone has done something that you consider pretty egregious, something that's just blatantly racist and you can't like get around it, when you talk about kind of dialing things down, what's a way to approach? What's that conversation look like? How do you initiate it without totally decimating a person? You know, and so that's the question.
I know that it's probably, so first of all, I'm going to ask two questions. One, are you talking about how do you do it or how should a white person do it?
I am talking about how I might do it, but I've had white people come to me and ask how they would do it, how they'd go and they'd talk to that person also. So.
Okay, can we just sit? I'll be better off trying to answer a question generally if I have one example of the kind of thing you're talking about. Just give me a quick example.
Well, this is like church, and I'm in church, and well, actually I wasn't there, but I got a call right away. And they read a poem, thinking that they're going to be an ally with Black folks by reading the poem, but they read it in dialect, and it's so glaringly that people walk out, and then I call right away. How do we handle this? So I guess that would be the question. I have not approached this person. I won't approach this person, but I do get people saying, well, what do I say? How do I do this? Or do I just beat them up?
Well, okay, so I found as a general matter, I think science has found this, shaming people, unless you're over them in a power structure, shaming people does not generally actually help move their thinking. Sometimes it moves their behavior, but it doesn't actually move their thinking. So if your goal is to move their thinking, then probably shaming and verbally beating them up is probably not helpful. So in that particular situation, I would probably do the whole intent impact situation, right? So it's so that dichotomy, I'm sure you're just to say for anybody who might not have heard people do that, that's something like you or somebody else saying to Chloe, you know, Chloe, that I bet your intention in doing that, I bet was to really show solidarity, to show allyship, to let people know that you think that the structures are a problem or whatever that is. Whatever is your best guess of their intention. Yeah, was that your intention? Yeah, so y'all can vibe on the intention before, and so Chloe feels that whoever's talking to her understands her intention. Mm-hmm. Before you say, okay, so here's what you should know about how this affected, let's say, me. The best way of showing somebody racism is to talk about racism in your own soul. The best way of trying to tune somebody up on something that was offensive was to not focus on it being offensive as a definition, but talking about how it bothered you personally. You maybe work towards how it was offensive generally, but like that's a definitional question. Then you get them into a battle about, or at least in their minds, about whether you judgment, or are you using social conventions correctly, or just all messed up. But a better place to start is, here's how that made me feel, right? So So this is essentially, I just did the intent impact thing. So you honor their intent and make them know that you honor it, and then talk at length, or at the length you need, to talk about the impact, potentially first on yourself and then on the social setting, right? But grounded in your own experience. So you're not just, they don't have to weigh just your analysis of some social setting, although you will get to that because this will walk out, right? But I think that you'll make more progress in getting through to Chloe if you first ground it in how you feel before you go to the social impact. But before you do any of that, talk about honor their intention. Does that answer? Am I in the ballpark of what you wanted to, what you're thinking about? Is she gone?
Yes, thank you. Thanks so very much. That was it.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that intent impact tool is very, very powerful in dealing with what some people call diversity disconnects. It's very powerful because one of the facts of the matter is that a situation can have really good intent and really bad impact. And so part of what is to do is to be able to do all of that with extensively and with passion and completeness. So if somebody does something that is unintentionally problematic, their intent, like there's a way in which, in part of what happens on the left, we say intent doesn't matter. I think that intent does matter. It doesn't completely drown out impact, but when you're trying to resolve something and help somebody move forward, I think that lifting up, that sometimes you can have good intent and bad impact, and ultimately the impact can be such that other intentions are undermined, can be helpful. That tool can help people see things. I feel like I'm on the Charlie Brown. The doctor is in.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
So one of the things, years ago when I was training as a young person in nonviolent action training work in the war, against the war, you know, we had a lot of some of these same principles. But then one day we went and we met somebody in a big corporation, and who was doing military production. And our whole point was to show how human we were, how reasonable we were, how he could identify with us as fellow believer, you know, all these things so that we could change his point of view essentially about what he was doing. But it wasn't until we actually got there that I realized that one of the problems with that was that we really were not prepared for his actual humanity. We weren't really prepared for the fact that he might have something to say to us, that we had a group of techniques, but anybody who dealt with us very long, I think, would have picked up the idea that they were still our project. We weren't really, as fellow human beings, connecting with that. And I wonder if that's something that you sometimes realize you're kind of grappling with. I'm not saying that you should just say, oh yeah, I'm willing to be a racist instead. You know, I mean, I don't mean that, but that there's some genuine humility required in accepting the fact that, wait a minute, you really might learn something that might undermine your bulwark.
You hit it right on the head. Part of, I mean, you're talking about this whole thing at a more advanced level. So let me say what you talked about the importance of actual genuine curiosity. You use that word, but that's what you talked about. Like, I could really learn something from this. That is vital. What I tell people is you need to demonstrate genuine or well-faked curiosity, because curiosity is important for building a sense of rapport. People need to feel that you really want to understand them. That's why you ask. That's the purpose of the ask step, right? So, but what you're talking about is a sort of higher order thing. Like, part of what I'm dealing with in my coaching of white folks is people say something racist and they either run for the hills or they attack them, right? What you're talking about is like the the higher orders of engagement, where you're not just doing a technique, but you're really having an authentic encounter. You're leaning into that. And I think that is right on. But at first, people are so triggered by these kind of things where they don't want to have an encounter because they can't, no, I can't take it.
Yeah.
Or they're not even having even something that feels like an encounter. They're just delivering a sermon. So what you're talking about is like the higher order, like that you're in the graduate course of all of this. But you are exactly correct. Like ultimately, what you're trying to do in this method is you're trying to put yourself in a position to have a real dialogue with this other human being. That's what you're doing, so that you come away with an expanded sense of how this person came to be who they are. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, that coming to that is not only for you, but it's actually good for them, because part of what I didn't say is that part of what you were grappling with a whole bunch of people who are post-racialist, is they kind of have a binary sense. Like racism either wasn't a past and now it's over, right? And what you're trying to do is to invite them to see that, well, there's certain things in the past that were bad and a problem, and thank God we made progress. And there's certain things that were bad and still are bad now. So you're inviting them to a more complex way of thinking. That itself, first of all, there's the conservative mind, if there is one. There's certain, on certain types of topics, people are less likely to kind of do that. Although on other types of topics, liberals less likely to do that. So part of what we're trying to do ultimately is to invite people into an authentic dialogue. But at this point, so you're right. But like I said, part of it, at this point, I'm just trying to get people to hang in there and just do the basic, like even basic processes that reflect compassion and empathy. People are not doing that. But yes, as you further develop your capacity, if you've taken courses in nonviolent communication activism, then you are clearly at a different level of this. But yeah, what you're trying to do is have an authentic dialogical encounter with somebody. And so I love the fact that you get it so deeply already.
It takes
Okay,
a lot
David,
of work for me to back up.
Say that again?
I mean, I think for me, it takes a huge amount of effort, honestly, to kind of take a deep breath and back up enough so that I am not so triggerable, so I can actually share a space without, leaping down somebody's throat or feel like something needs to be defended.
Part of what we try to teach in the course,
is a lot of practice.
These methods in a stepwise fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of like the first set of homeworks are on relaxation methods and listening tips. And one of the, like in the first, between the session 1 and session 2, part of what we try to get you to do is just to get in touch with what relaxation methods are useful for you, because there are relaxation methods that people have found you can learn how to do them in 5 minutes, and then 3 minutes, and then 1 minute, which is the time it might take to be in the bathroom, right? To learn which ones work for you, and then which listening tips help you become a more empathetic listener. So part of the first homework is to, after you learn some of those for you, is to engage other people, ask questions, and maybe start out with people with issues that you're not going to disagree with, move up to things that you might disagree with but are not triggering like racial issues, just to learn how to manage yourself, to take in information that you disagree with and not try to rebut it all the time, right? So it's a stepwise process of learning these methods, where ultimately by the end, you're much more able to engage somebody who has racially problematic views without falling apart, and with a mindset towards what I need to do to stay engaged. Like your goal is to manage the encounter so that you are authentically yourself in most or all of the encounter, some or all of the encounter, and to leave the person like with the sense that I wouldn't mind talking to this person who might like them about race again. A whole bunch of us don't do that. And so with that as the effectiveness criteria, we try to take you through a process where you exercise those skills in a stepwise way so that by the end you can do that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Tom he's going to log off in a second, and he probably wants to say something to all of us. before that happens.
Well, I actually don't have anything to say other than huge gratitude for everyone being here. I just have another call coming up in just a few minutes, so I need to step out. But if people want to stay on and go as long as possible, and we'll get all the information out about the upcoming course within the next few days. So thanks, everyone, and thank you, David.
Sure. Well, I appreciate the chance, Tom. And again, my hope is to get as many people as possible. It's a good collaboration between the project and come to the table. And, you know, doesn't your chapter want to be the one that wins the free books? So we hope that people sign up. And these courses, again, people have told us that it's like, it not only helps you on this issue, but it helps you generally. So I'm appreciative of people's interest.
So David, in the chat, a lot of people are asking more information about the structure of the class. And I know Tom's going to send more details, but perhaps if you could just talk about that a bit now.
Okay, so the class meets on Tuesday nights, starting on June the 9th. It meets every other Tuesday from 8 to 9:30 Eastern. So it meets for an hour and a half. But there's homework in between, where, as I mentioned a minute ago, we give you things to practice doing. And they're somewhat about self-regulation, but ultimately it's self-regulation with the aim of you practicing those methods with other people. Now, I know many of us are on this quarantine lockdown, and so what we're doing now with courses we're doing now is to encourage people to not only use it with their family, but since this is a time where we're socially distant and some of us are reaching out to other people on the phone, is to use other forms of connection to practice these methods. We're doing what we're dealing with, so there's no way to stop this quarantining, but we still think that the work is important. So there'll be meetings every other Tuesday, and then homework in between, where when you do that and you do a short write-up that we will review and give you some feedback on, so that by the time the next meeting happens, some coaching in writing has taken place. So that's the basic structure in actual settings, in the sessions. We mostly focus on coaching and not the presentation of material, because we have enough material online where I'm not giving a lot of lectures in the classes, because we want to use that time collectively to really maximize the benefit of being together collectively. So, in those, I'm not looking at the questions. Does that answer? Okay.
Hi.
It's like the red light came on. Look at that.
Paul, you're up.
I didn't have anything to say. I don't know how that happened. Hi, I did. Hi, I'm Barbara from Los Angeles. I have a question actually about the term white allyship, and I've heard it embraced by some and not embraced by others, and I'm kind of exploring where I am on that. I mean, partly I feel like the term allyship for me means racism is somebody else's problem and I am allied with them in fixing it. But I also feel like racism is created by white people and that I'm not an ally. But I also feel like I don't want to appropriate the pain of people of color who have suffered the direct experience of racism. So I'm just...
So there's no good way out of that, right?
All of this, it feels like allyship is too... like you can opt in or opt out of being an ally. So I'm just, you've mentioned.
Okay, so here's my take on that.
Yeah.
I would say the two things of what you said. Well, let me give you the big picture. Is that one of the things we have to be careful on the left is a hyper focus on terminology. So I'm gonna answer your question, but I'm just saying as a general, I think one of the dysfunctions that happens on the left is that we can spend a whole bunch of energy on arguing about terms and what's the right term. Like I've seen so many conversations about racism go nowhere between allies and racism skeptics on how we define racism. So people spend all their energy talking about like how we define racism instead of talking about how racism actually works to create different experiences of people. So I'm just saying, as a general matter, I want to be careful of that. I still want to address what you said. So first thing I would say is, this is David's opinion, is that while I do think that it is very valuable for white people to think about, in a discerning, subtle way, what are the ways in which racism impacts them, like victimizes them. So, for example, many people have talked about like the way our cities are laid out have been like the way that white flight happened, the way the suburbanization happened, white flight happened, like, and the way that the urban sprawl is a function of racism in the past. And so you're stuck in traffic, you're not thinking about the fact that this was racism in the 70s that created that, but it is, right? So that's just one illustration. So what I'm saying is I think it's valuable for white folks who care about racism to do some thinking, reading, or study about like, how would I articulate why racism, how or why racism impacts me? So that's useful to do. And I think there's no question that on a basic level, racism impacts white people less than it does people of color. So I have no problem with thinking that that's true, and that a white person who decides to devote significant energy to the task of solving racism is opting in on something they don't have to do. Now, there's many reasons for doing that, and I support all of that thinking. But the fact of the matter is that white folks will have to do this. So one of the things I'm trying to do in this project is to not only, I want to equip people, I want to empower people, I want to encourage people, because I think that as much as white allies need to be criticized, part of what happens in the anti-racism movement is that too much energy goes to criticizing people as opposed to encouraging them. Now, criticism is important to do. We all need to be criticized. But I'm just saying, from a just emotional level, I think we spend too much on that, and too much on that, especially given that white folks ain't got to do this. They can do like the vast majority of white folks, and even who are in the 45% think racism is real, don't make it an issue for them personally. Don't spend energy on that personally. So I think that you can, God bless you for opting in. That's an option. That's the nature of how racism works, right? So, so I'm not stuck on it. I'm not stuck on enforcing the term ally. I've heard all that stuff about, I don't want allies, I want apprentices, or I want accessories. I don't want allies, I want activists. That's all lovely, and we had a conversation at the right time. But on the basic level, when we have 55% of white people don't think racism is real, and 45% who do, I think it's useful to have some kind of language to separate those out, right? To talk about the different sides of that, and in service of how do the people who are allies, or whatever you want to call the people who think is real, have an impact on the people who don't, to convert more people. So I tend to use the ally versus post-racialist or racism skeptic, but I'm not enforcing that language, but I think that there's a value in making that separation. So whatever language you need to do that is fine, because we don't want to over-obsess on the language. It's really about what are we doing.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that. Appreciate that.
Sure.
You've given
And
me a
that
lot.
is the last question. Thank you, everyone.
So that was the last question? Well, listen, I'm so grateful for the chance to talk to y'all. This was my first stand-up at-home keynote. I did it before seated, and part of the reason I had technical problems is because we changed the thing around and then redid it, took it down, and put it back up. So I am grateful for the chance to talk to y'all. Thank you so much for your time. I am going to get the recording to Tom later this evening, so that'll be up at wherever he puts that up. And I want to express my appreciation to you for your focus on this topic. And I hope to see you in the course. And the most important thing I want to close on is thank you for your allyship.